and we looked at what was God going to do. And so how was God going to bring forth his plan to redeem? So we're going to start with Abram. And the term means father, which is somewhat ironic, probably for him, given that he is not a father for most of his life. And the call to leave the place where he lives in the house of his father and go to the land that God will show him. So God renews the promise with Abraham and Sarah that he made to mankind at creation. So once again, just like we saw with Adam and Eve, and we saw with Noah and his wife, God is renewing his creation, and the promise is going to echo the promise that he gave Adam and Eve in the garden. So that there's going to be he's going to make a great nation out of them, which echoes the command to be fruitful and to multiply. That he will give blessing. He will make their name great. So God is going to give them a great name, which contrasts with Babel, where mankind tries to give itself a great name. And that all nations will be blessed through this family. And there will be given a land to dwell in. Okay? We remember that the story up until now has been mankind living with God and because of their sin, getting pushed further and further and further and further away from God, being exiled further away. And this is where God finally says, you will have a place. I will bring you back to the garden. So, just as we've seen before, this is still God's plan, is to restore the garden, to restore mankind to right relationship between themselves, and to restore mankind to right relationship with him. However, we see the story keeps repeating itself, which is immediate failure. Almost immediately, Abram fails to live up to his calling. First off, he leaves the promised land. He gets to the land of Canaan, and there's a famine, and he doesn't trust God, and so he starts drifting towards Egypt. And then, because he's worried, because Sarah is beautiful, and he's worried that the Egyptians will kill him and take her, he decides to just give her away. And so instead of trusting that God will take care of them, Abram just lies, and that will have consequences. However, we still see that God is faithful. God is faithful even when his people are unfaithful. So what God does is he establishes a covenant. So this is the second time that we have this term covenant that's used. The first covenant is made with Noah and his family, and now God is going to establish a covenant with Abram. That he's going to give them a multitude of descendants. Once again, promises the land of Canaan, and this is where the covenant is going to be a little bit different, because the covenant with Noah is a covenant that for mankind, but also a covenant with the earth. But here, this covenant is going to be special for Abram and his descendants. Once again, we see that Abram and Sarah conspire to give themselves descendants. They are not they are not going to trust God. They are going to work to make things come about on their own terms. Once again, this is the choice of the garden. God gives mankind the choice. Will you allow me to define, will you trust me to know what is good and evil? Or will you seize good and evil in your own hands and choose to do what is good in your own eyes? And every time that man seizes that power to define good and evil in their own eyes, we just break things more and more. So Sarah gives her maidservant to Abram, and Hagar will conceive and give birth to Ishmael, which is going to cause huge conflict. And they will end up being banished. However, God will still bless Ishmael because of his promise to Abram. The Ishmaelites are going to show up again and again in this story. We're going to see them, and it's going to cause problems. The history will be between the people of it, or the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac. There's going to be conflict, and if Muslim theology history is to be trusted on this, well, they claim that Ishmael is the son of the promise, not Isaac. And we know that conflict is still alive and horribly well in our day and age. But God is still faithful even when his people are not. And so we have the covenant with Abraham. So there's a changing of names, and names are significant. Obviously, it's who you're called, but especially biblical names. There seems to be this kind of dual purpose with names, where your name is not just who you are, an easy way of calling yourself, but they also describe a person's character to the point that sometimes the names might as well be nicknames. They're quite prophetic in many ways. So the names are changed from Abram to Abraham, from father to father of many, and from Sarai to Sarah, from my princess to just princess. And so this is the changing of the name affirms God's covenant, especially that He will give them descendants, but also that this reflects a more global promise, that truly it will be all the nations of the world that will be blessed through Abraham and Sarah's descendants. And that the covenant will also come through the promised son. It will come through Isaac and not Ishmael. And Abraham is given the sign of the covenant, which will be circumcision. And once again, the son is the promised son. The promise of a son is repeated. And you know where we're going to go next. What happens next? What's the next thing that Abraham and Sarah do? They try to fix it. So we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is horribly disturbing, and what goes on, and the story of Lot's daughters and how they give their father descendants. They decide to take matters into their own hands and how they're going to accomplish things, and this just poisons relationship. And in fact, the Lot's descendants will be in conflict with Abraham's descendants for a very long time. And then Abraham lies to Abimelech, who is one of the leaders that is right there. So he lies about Sarah being his sister again. And so this refrain, God is faithful, man isn't faithful. God is faithful, but man isn't faithful. And so we finally come to the moment where Abraham trusts God enough to give up his control. They are finally given a son, Isaac. And God asks the unthinkable, for Abraham to trust him enough to give up his own son. And when Isaac asks where the sacrifice is, Abraham in faith says that God will provide. And of course, in this we see that this is prophetic, that God will provide the sacrifice. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his own son, but will not let him do it. But God will give up his own son for our sin. God doesn't ask us to do anything that he wasn't willing to do. Unfortunately, the refrain keeps up. We have this great moment of faith of Abraham, and then Sarah dies. And Abraham takes up another wife and has multiple concubines and will have multiple sons through them. And because he wants to protect Isaac, which instead of not having multiple concubines and wives, he just ends up sending all the sons away. So we see that there's this brokenness that comes in when man acts according to his own desires. However, we still see God's faithfulness. God blesses all the sons, even the sons that are cast aside, and because of his promise to Abraham. And so then we go, Abraham, okay, his faith is still lauded in the Bible. Abraham believed, and it was counted as to him as righteousness. And then we have Isaac and Jacob, and it just gets better and better. And it gets better and better. Isaac means laughter, and Jacob means the trickster, or literally the one who clutches at the heel of the other. So these names are obviously quite prophetic. Isaac doesn't get very much in the way of story. His story is just a couple chapters. But God establishes the covenant, reestablishes his covenant with Isaac. And we see that Isaac will trust in God to give him a descendant because Rebekah is sterile. And he prays for her. He intercedes to God on her behalf, and she does conceive. And they give birth to twins, Esau and Jacob. And they start fighting from within the womb. And from the start, from their birth, they will be completely opposite. And God does something different. God says that the youngest one will rule over the oldest. So the blessing will not pass through the oldest son, but it will pass through the second son. And God will, like I said, God renews the covenant with Isaac, and then Isaac does the same thing his dad does, and tells Abimelech that, oh no, this is my sister. But you know the story, how things go. And it keeps going downhill. The parents play favorites. Okay? We're not supposed to have favorites, but Isaac loves Esau more, and Rebekah loves Jacob more, and that brings tension in the family. But we also see maybe why God chooses Jacob over Esau, because Esau despises his birthright and sells it away for some stew. But we also see the character of Jacob, who's the trickster. Jacob uses him when he's at his weakest to get what he wants. And then Jacob and Rebekah, instead of trusting God, conspire to steal the blessing from Isaac when he's blind. So, obviously, when we look at these, we see that God is taking flawed people and still somehow managing to use them for his glory. But we see the same problem. Jacob ends up taking 2 wives and 2 concubines, but he only loves one of them. Now, obviously, if he had taken 2 wives and 2 concubines and loved all 4 of them equally, that would not have been a great thing either. It would not have been a great thing either. But doing this is going to bring a huge amount of conflict into his family, which we will see later on. And he still lives up to his name, although Laban does pull one over Jacob to kind of put him back in his place. Jacob returns the favor and tricks Laban out of his flocks and out of his riches, to the point where Laban basically wants to kill him because Jacob's Jacob. And so Jacob is forced to run away. And this is where God established his covenant with Jacob. It's going to happen twice. I am going a little bit out of sequence. But the first covenant is at Bethel, which is the house of the Lord. So here is, this is right after Jacob has conspired to steal the blessing from his older brother. God renews the covenant with him, that God will be with him, that he will receive the land of Canaan, that he will have many descendants, and that he will be a blessing. And Jacob accepts, but and if you will, and if you will, and if you will, and if, then you will be my God. Instead of recognizing what God is offering him. And then this covenant is repeated at Peniel. This is when God wrestles with Jacob and changes his name to Israel, which is going to be prophetic, which is who wrestles with God. And this is going to be the story of God's people. There will be this constant fight and struggle between God and his people, between God who is calling them to come to be with him and people who are going to resist him every step of the way, trying to choose good and evil in their own eyes. And that is only going to lead to destruction and chaos. And so God here will renew his promise. And once again, we have the changing of names, which is important for renewing the covenant. And so we see Abraham and we see his faith and his ups and downs. We see Isaac and we see his faith and we see his ups and downs. And we see Jacob and his faith, I guess, and his downs and his ups. And we get to Joseph and company, which is how not to solve your family drama. And the story of how God takes evil and brings about good somehow. We see that Jacob's sin has consequences that go beyond his life, that will extend down the generations. So the favoritism he shows Rachel, it will sow discord between his wives and between his children, which leads to Joseph's brothers hate him so much, or so jealous of him, that they're about to kill him, but then decide to do the moral thing and just sell him into slavery. Yeah. Like I said, how not to solve family drama. And then we see the story of how individual sons will fail. Okay, Reuben sleeps with his father's concubine, which and because of that, he will lose the birthright. Reuben's the firstborn, but he will lose the birthright. And then Simon and Levi, they murder the entire male population of the city to avenge their sister. And they lose their birthright because of that. And then Judah sleeps with his daughter-in-law, thinking she is a prostitute. We see that God uses broken people to bring about his will, because Judah's descendants from Tamar will come the line that will bring David and will bring Jesus. And so God is able to use the brokenness of mankind to still bring about his plan. And we see this in the story of Joseph and Egypt. Joseph, for once, we see someone who puts his trust in God fully and ends up ruling in Egypt. And in fact, when he is tempted, when he is given the choice of trusting God to do what is right, or to take good and evil in his own hands and do what is right in his own eyes, he chooses to trust God. Remember, he received a vision that he would be the greatest among his brothers. And he does not try, obviously, he comes off as a little bit arrogant when he shares his dream, or a bit naive maybe, but he does not try to take matters into his own hand, to make that prophecy come true, to make God's promise come true. He decides to trust. And because of that, he will save his family from starvation and save the entire land of Egypt as well. And so we see that God still uses broken people to do his work. And so we come to Jacob's last blessing. There's this, so it's an entire poem, and he gives blessings to each of his sons. These are prophetic blessings, which will actually be the basis of how the land of Canaan is divided as well. And we have one important promise, is that the scepter, the rod of authority, will belong to the house, to Judah and his house. And we know that that David is the descendant of Judah, and Jesus is the descendant of David. So, in conclusion, where do we get from there? Well, we see that God uses everything for his good. Every time the patriarchs do evil, God uses it for good. When Abraham decides not to trust God and to go to Egypt, God uses that to bless him with wealth, even though he doesn't deserve it. When Isaac also lies about his wife, God still blesses him with wealth and gives him more possessions. With Jacob, God really takes a small group of people, just families, and starts to make them into a greater number. And still he blesses them. And through Jacob's sons, even though they do wrong, God still works things for good, even if we don't see it or we don't understand how it's happening. And so where we're now? Well, they've grown in number. They're still not a great multitude, but there's a few more people than when we started. They have been blessed with great wealth. Other nations have been blessed by Abraham's family. Joseph has saved the land of Egypt from famine through his trust in God. However, they have no land. They are still foreigners in a foreign country. And so that's where we end the story of the patriarchs. We end up in Egypt. God has called them to a land that he will show them, but they're not in that land yet. And so what we're going to be seeing next week is that story, how God is going to bring his people and carry them from the land of Egypt, from a foreign land, and take them to the land that he has promised them. few minutes left. I will open it up if anyone has any thoughts, comments, concerns, questions. Feel free to go.
Jordan, it always sticks out to me that, you know, when God wrestles with Jacob,
Yeah.
right? Because I think we sometimes get the impression sometimes, and especially in the Old Testament, God is just this, like, he's this on high being. The people disobey him. He wants to smite them. You know, he strikes down numerous people in punishment. But I think it's really cool and really encouraging for us that, you know, God is willing to get down and dirty with us, right? It is okay. It is okay to wrestle with God about things that you don't understand.
Yes.
It's okay to question. You know, where we see them fall short, right, is that they decide to question on their own without talking to God about it, and then just follow their own plan. But from whatever I've read of Scripture, God does not have a problem with us questioning him to him and letting him answer for himself, which I think is really, really neat.
Highlighting that when God tells Abraham of his plan that he will judge Sodom and Gomorrah for their sin, you know, Abraham tells God, "Well, will you punish the innocent with the wicked?" And God says, "No, that's not who I am." And Abraham bargains God down to, for the sake of 5, will you not spare Sodom and Gomorrah? And God says, "Okay, I will say, for the sake of 5, I will spare Sodom and Gomorrah." Which, if we do the math, we have Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. Just needed 1 more, and God would have spared them. But that goes to show you how bad things are, that God can't even find 5 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And even then, the ones who are righteous in God's eyes, he does spare, if they will trust in him to get away, to get out of his way.
You mentioned the trust in God, and Joseph at the end, you know, his brothers are afraid that when the dad dies, he's going to kill him.
Yeah.
And his answer to him is, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good."
Yeah.
So he can even take something that's wrong. He could even see God's going to use this to make good things happen and not take revenge on him.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Kind of along those lines, a lot of people look at Old Testament and they think, wrathful God, vengeful, hateful, you know what I mean, like mean God. And I see all this, and then, you know, even when I know we're not there yet, but even when you get into the Kings, right, and some of the darkest days that Israel and Judah have, I see this and think, what a loving and optimistic God that he keeps giving opportunities. He keeps reminding people of his promise. He keeps, right, when he could have just written us off, done away with us, you've got to be not just loving but optimistic for your creation to keep doing this over and over again. And patient, by the way.
Yes, very much so.
One son and I were having a talk kind of about the same, only in the present day.
Mhm.
And we were talking about, you know, sometimes things will happen that we don't understand why God would allow it. And my son said, you know, and sometimes pretty important things in our country. And he said, but if God allows it, then it's in his will. And he's going to find a way to make it work to his good.
Yep.
We don't always know what it is. You know, we don't see it yet. But I think that was a good point to help us accept things that maybe we don't totally understand. Why would God allow that to happen, you know? Like, especially right now in our country with a lot of the negative things that are going on.
I think one of the things I think is really interesting is despite all of the bad things that they all do, and some of the times it's like, you don't hear that they are talking about God to the next generation, but it seems evident that like God is still a part of the conversation, because all of the kids, whether they make good choices or not, seem to understand who God is, at least to an extent. And even like in Genesis 50 with Joseph, and he's like, at some point God is going to come and he's going to bring you back to where the promise was, which again, to me, one shows that he believes that to be true, but also that like that was a part of the regular conversation that must have happened enough that 3 generations later, Joseph is like, this is going to happen, and when it does, this is what I want you to do. And so I think that for me is encouraging of like, despite all of the dumb or bad things that I do as a parent, if I'm paying attention to like God and Jesus as a part of our life and as a part of what we say and as a part of how we're trying to live, like those things can be overlooked or forgiven in some forms, and
Yes.
our kids can still manage to know who God is in a good way.
That's the story that we see throughout the Bible. It's the story of redemption, of God taking broken things and making them whole again, and somehow making something more beautiful out of it, in spite of us.
One thing I think that's interesting to note is that there's a long time that goes between when Joseph resists the temptation and when he to sleep with Potiphar's wife, and when he actually is made ruler. You know, he's thrown in prison and he spends years there. And we kind of think, oh, well, when you trust God, then you're blessed and that's, you know, everything goes right for you. But it's like his choice to obey God's way landed him in prison. And he was there for years, you know, and still trusted and still just faithfully did. And little by little, you know, God had a plan in his timing of when he was going to redeem that situation. I mean, and you'd already highlighted that Joseph doesn't take things into his own hands. He just faithfully serves and trusts God. And I think that's a good application for us too, is like sometimes we might trust God and the circumstances are still going to look confusing to us.
Yes.
And we're not going to understand. It's like, I chose obedience, so why is it still like this? You know, but trusting that God is in the long run.
And in the Bible, it says in that story, and God was with him in prison. And so we think, you know, like God was sitting beside him every day going, I'm right here. But in actuality, knowing human nature, did he feel like God was with him all the time? Probably not. He's just like us.